From Buffalo, Toronto Public Media, and WBFO, this is Buffalo What's Next Producers Picks. Highlights of conversations heard on previous episodes. On this week's program, we'll hear about the origins of the Juneteenth celebration in Buffalo from Judson Price.
A lot of people who kind of dissed Juneteenth and thought it was just a grassroots something. Since they found out they could get such an exposure, everybody came. Sororities, fraternities, fraternal units, politicians, and everybody.
Next, author and mental health counselor Andre Stokes Jr. explores the mental health issues prevalent in men of color.
Black men, being around black men is one of the most healthy things that we can do for each other. I mean, of course, with regard to being positive about whatever the situation is.
And finally, Barbara Cole, the artistic director at Just Buffalo Literary Center, and Sydney Clifton celebrate the literary career of Lucille Clifton.
Buffalo is just so clearly such an important foundational grounding throughout so much of her work. And that's part of the reason why we felt it was so important for Buffalo to really recognize Clifton as one of the great writers who has walked these streets.
We begin with Juneteenth, a yearly national celebration commemorating the end of slavery in the United States. It got its start here in Buffalo in 1976 by a group of community-minded members of the East Side. One of those members was Judson Price. Thomas O'Neill White had the opportunity to sit down and speak to Judson about how the event got off the ground.
You're an integral part of the history of Black Buffalo, helping to create the first Juneteenth event in the city's history. What was it like organizing the event, which is the first of its kind in Buffalo?
Well, the first thing I'd like to mention is that when we were at a bill meeting, the activist organization that actually started Juneteenth was at a meeting, and the director, Bill Gator, said, because it was celebrating the bicentennial, 4th of July. So he said, let's see if we can find something that's contiguous of, black freedom. Nobody knew anything. So I asked some of the fellas if someone would go out, and they went to the library, UB library or downtown library or somewhere. And he came back shortly and said he heard this Jubilee celebration. Then he said, Jubilee, actually it was called Juneteenth. And he said, that's it, okay. And so from that, we started.
You mentioned Build and William Gator, who's got a parkway named after him. Can you talk a little bit about William Gator and Build community for those who don't know?
Yes, Bill Gator was the director of the Bill organization, which was a very productive, strong, activist organization in the city of Buffalo. And he was a bus driver, and he just quit in order to work on this project. And he was very ingenious in reference to various techniques of dealing with the various problems. It was what dealt with schools, jobs, work, and everything. And so what we would do is come up with ideas and work on them. And one of the real good ones I would like to mention is we were having trouble with the banks. And the banks, because they're the ones that lend the money to the contractors to do jobs that we couldn't get. Mm-hmm. So he said, okay, we'll do. They got a busload of people and went to the bank with people adding 10 cents to their account, borrowing, putting in 5 cents. Had about 30 people doing that. Mm-hmm. And then the officer at the bank said, oh, wait a minute. And they got together and said, let's talk. That was one of the things they did. And they started talking, and we did get some workers in the different department stores that were not there.
And how did Juneteenth get off the ground? And also, was it originally held in MLK Park? Has it always been held?
No, it was on Jefferson first. Jefferson, and unfortunately, a lot of people always say, let's go back on Jefferson, because it was like we could promenade up and down the street, and you could see everybody, and it worked out fine. But that's when it was very small. We had maybe 50, 60 concessionaires. But now we have the hundreds of concessionaires, food, clothing, artifacts, and everything. But what was interesting, the very first Juneteenth, and the only Juneteenth that was rained out was the first one.
Oh.
was the first one, and we just stopped. And we didn't have too much invested at that time as far as money into the people selling food. So we stopped it and started the next week.
Did you previously know about Juneteenth?
No, that is what's interesting. We knew nothing about Juneteenth. Like I said, we had someone go out and find what could we celebrate. And so he found that, and then we started celebrating. And I'd like to mention this too. A lot of people, since we've been celebrating it so long in Buffalo, they think that it started here. And I have a flag over there that my daughter brought in. It's 1865. Mm-hmm. It was continuous, except they stopped during the Depression. They stopped during the war. Didn't have celebrations. But we knew nothing about it.
So what was the process of getting the event off the ground? We're talking 1976?
76, yes. The first thing we did was try to get people for a parade, which always start out with a good event. And then we just said, what do we do? And then, of course, if you're having a festival, you had to have food. So we got people who would be selling food. And then, of course, artifacts and different things. And also, we had it on Jefferson Avenue. Jefferson Avenue, because at that time, there was very, very few businesses. And we did it on Jefferson so that it would increase businesses and so forth, or bring them back. And so that's how we started.
Was Jefferson like the kind of like the heart of Black Buffalo at that time?
Yes, somewhat, yes.
And we saw a picture of you right here.
Yeah.
Making flags and stuff. And where'd you come up with that idea?
Well, we were just thinking of what we could do. We just come up with different ideas, and I like to do different things. Now, I can't find one of the pennants. There are pennants. And also it was the design on the first Juneteenth shirts. And I had learned a little bit about silkscreen printing when I was taking industrial arts at Buff State. And so that was the one I kind of liked. And so I just said what I could do. And at that time you had to draw and cut a stencil. Now you can do it
on the computer. Yeah, just like that.
With the acetate, put it on the screen that you put on photograph sensitive material. And then let it sit there a while and take it out, wrench it, and you got your screen.
So making those pennants pretty time consuming.
Very time consuming, very difficult. And at that time we had regular paint.
Oh.
Inks. It was not water. Now they have watercolors. When you finish with the screen, just wash it out. Before, it was tough.
How did word spread, or how'd you get the word out that, hey, we're doing this Juneteenth march or festival on Jefferson? Was it just word of mouth?
It was word of mouth, and also through block clubs and everything. And I think also since Buffalo is not that large, people knew people all over North, South, East, West Buffalo, and the word spread. And it wasn't difficult because people were anxious, really anxious to do something in lieu of 4th of July.
Ah, I see. So what was the atmosphere like for the first Juneteenth? Well, you said it got rained out originally.
It was, glorious, because we had all kind of marches down Jefferson and had groups. Then we had a stage. And at that time, those who had some talent, they wanted to be seen. And they would do it for nothing, not like now. And they would come so that with the crowd that we had, they were happy to be able to perform.
And it's 1976. So what kind of music are we talking about? We're talking soul, we're talking funk?
All kinds of music. All kinds of music. At that time, whatever it was, I danced with all of them.
Has the manner in which we collectively celebrate Juneteenth changed since you guys first started here in Buffalo? And in addition to yourself and William Gator, who were the other people who started up the festival?
Oh, well, actually, the young man who was president for over 20 years was Marcus Brown. Then we had other people who was on the committee or the board that would do the various jobs they would, assigned to do.
My first Juneteenth assignment in 2019, I interviewed Marcus Brown.
Yes.
And that's who we saw at the flag raising.
Right. And he was the one I told about it, and he started and he became president for over 20 years. And he did a lot with the parade.
What have you seen change from the first Juneteenth to now, to what it is now?
I think the organization, and I didn't do it, but I meant to get a list of maybe 20 different auxiliaries, whatever you want to call it, that we have now. Food, entertainment, culture. We had people with doing the chess. We had everything you can think of, kids organizations and kids parks. And so it just came out to have about 30 different venues.
And you've seen Buffalo change so much throughout your lifetime. How has Buffalo improved, and what things do you think have worsened in the city?
Well, that's hard to say. But I think the so-called integration did not work. I was counseling when they first started integrating the schools. And what made it so bad for the students that we had at our schools, they could not go to the so-called feeder schools unless they were up high, at least on grade level. And so we lost our good students. And as far as I can see and concern, we did not get any students coming into our schools other than City Honors,
Right.
Olmsted, and things like that. And many of the schools are closed now. So many of them with housing. So we have a lot less people.
Do you consider yourself an educator?
Pardon me?
And do you consider yourself an educator?
Oh yes.
So what is there a quick fix solution to this problem? Is there a long-term solution to this problem? What do you think?
I would think the long-term solution is always kind of mellow in. Fast solution that we did when we integrated the schools and other things like that and closed schools, it didn't work. We used to walk to school, and it took 10 minutes to walk to school, and I always thought at 9 o'clock we'd get to school, 10 after 9 you finish your bell work, and you've done a lot of work. Now the students are on the bus for hours. We've just kind of cleared that up with the so-called 3-bell system. And it's unbelievable how we've lost the schools. There was one around the corner. And
Which one was that?
that was 59. Actually, they moved over to the museum. So it's been called the
That's right.
Museum School Science. Oh, Drew Science School.
Yes. Yep.
You have one that moved to the zoo, zoo school.
In addition to creating the Juneteenth Festival here, you've pretty much risked your life for the betterment of the city. Can you talk about that? I realize
a little
it's a
bit.
touchy subject.
Basically, I was a block club president, and that's one thing. Even the Bill organization started with a host of block clubs starting to help the community, and I just happened to be here, and you can see I've been here over 60 years, and so we had a block club, and that really helped us keep the things in order. And I was secretary most of the time for someone who was really working in the area, but wasn't so-called, schooled that much, but very hard worker and good at making contact with the youngsters. So that's how we operated. And what happened as far as the trouble, the same fellows who really caused the trouble are fellows we worked with. They were the young fellows we worked with. It just so happened one fellow who wasn't too cool, he wanted to do what he wanted to do, and he did what he did. But I was blessed because I didn't hit my teeth. It went in, and a little part stayed in my chest, and it was about a half inch from my so-called aorta, and everything was fine. Hit the floor, and my wife was here, and I got up, and she was about to run anywhere, everywhere, and jaw was split. I headed to the bathroom to look. I never got there. I can't recall, and I'm glad that I didn't. But we had a good block club, and it just happened these young fellas got into this business from some other people outside the community. And those who did not work with those fellas became all kind of successful people. and so forth. Wall Street, prison guards, teachers, and everything who worked with the block club and were not in this so-called drug business. But I had no trouble with the fellas because actually some of the fellas I taught their grandfathers. And so it made it easy for me because they wouldn't get after anybody. You taught my grandfather. And just like I said, one person who was not too cool. And I think he killed several other people. In fact, he's in now from 50 to life.
Wow.
Yeah. But the other fellas and most of the people on the street, great, no trouble at all.
Every time I talk to someone who's a member of the block club, I always want to, I ask them to like stress the importance of block clubs, especially in this community.
Oh, the importance is just unbelievable because we used to keep this street clean. We used to sweep the street. We had meetings. We had dollar for dues. We get a right proposals in order to get money from the city to have monies to do certain things. And of course, being in school, I was writing a lot of those, and I took pictures and sent with it, and it worked out very well. But they were very important, the block clubs, very important in getting the people to know each other, because now don't know the people on either side, just one side. Across the street here, don't know anybody. And those who were here at the time we moved, there's only a couple families that's still here. All the others have gone or passed on and so forth. But it's hard to say. No, it's not hard to say. It's very important, the block clubs, very, very important.
Coming up next on Producer's Picks, in observance of Men's Mental Health Month, which takes place in June, our own Charles Gilbert had a deeply personal and important conversation with Best Self mental health counselor and author Andre Stokes Jr. They delve into the mental challenges that men, and mainly men of color, face in today's world.
I want to dive into like the trauma that men suffer that we don't talk about.
Okay. Yep.
Because that's a thing that is always stigma or a stereotype that we aren't allowed to showcase or show our feelings.
Right.
How do you feel about that?
So that had fluctuated throughout my personal development. I can say within my, let's say, teenage years, within my mid to late 20s, I definitely felt that was the way it was supposed to be. As men, we're supposed to always be resilient in any situation. And in part, being resilient in any situation incorporates never complaining. And that being resilient in any situation incorporates keeping it to yourself and keeping it within your spirit, and not kind of, for lack of better words, contaminating the area with your needs, right? Mm-hmm. Because as men, we are protectors, we're providers. We provide guidance to our families, to our children, and so forth. So in my mind at the time, I thought that was how the structure of that was supposed to be, until I realized that the situations and the challenges that I was going through in my 20s were not improving. And it took me a while to realize that. So upon realization of that, I realized that I needed to go the other route, because the method that I was doing just wasn't working.
What method was that?
Silence. That method was silence. Silence is a killer.
It is.
It's literally a killer. So going that route, I always thought that was the right thing to do until I realized it wasn't, because my problems were getting worse. Those problems included financial vulnerability as a new father. Those problems included relationship struggles as a new father, and so forth. So it got to a point where I finally admitted that maybe what I'm doing right now with the silence is simply not working. That took me a long time, because again, as men, we have that pride. Mm-hmm. We have that ego, and those things can be counterintuitive to recovery, right? So as I realized I needed to go the opposite direction, I found the benefit in speaking to a counselor at the time. I believe I was 27. I think I was 27. And I found that it was starting to help a little bit, and just in small doses, because at first, of course, when you switch spectrums, I was a little bit resistant to the things that the counselor had to say, and I was resistant to even the idea. But once I kind of let myself go and put my guard down, I saw that my ability to think was a little more clear. It was a little more sharp, and I was able to think more logically versus emotionally. And throughout that transition, I found that I was incorrect for a large portion of my life before that, and that kind of opened up a new door into what I wanted to do career-wise and what I wanted to do socially as far as mental health and emotional development.
You said a lot right there, and I'm processing everything that you said. Now, with you saying you were like your form of dealing with it was silence, very similar to me. I even to this day sometimes tend to, when I'm getting angry, when I feel like that, I go quiet. I don't speak. But through therapy, and also just my mother, she still to this day gets a little she gets a little upset with me, because she'll be able to tell, and then she'll ask me like, what's wrong, and I won't say nothing, and she'll be like, all right, like, her thing was just like, she was just like, if something's bothering you, just say you don't want to talk about it right now. And I'm learning to kind of, even in my 30s, I'm learning like, okay, let me just say, okay, I don't want to talk about it right now, because I have to kind of gather my thoughts, figure out how can I express it without showing emotion to a degree. And I say that because we tend to react off of emotion first. And I've learned to kind of get the emotion out first. How I do it is I journal. I journal first. And then after I let everything out, raw emotion, then I'm able to come to the table and say, okay, this is what's going on, because I've let that emotion get out of me first, and then I come rational. As we're both fathers, and you were saying, as men, we are the provider, we are the protector. Recently, I was in a conversation with a group of men, fathers, and they were talking about how they have to suffer in silence. Similar to what we were just saying. But as fathers, it seems like it's more intense, because we can't show vulnerability. Society tells us we can't show that vulnerability. I know that you was kind of speaking about the reasons, why, but dive more into that as far as fatherhood goes and the suffering that fathers go through.
Okay, sure. So that's an umbrella that has a couple different pathways below it, and I'm very glad that you asked this question. So, with regard to fatherhood, Black male fatherhood, we have to think about a few things. We have to think about the relationships that we have with our children, the relationships we have with their mothers, and the relationships that we have with families on both sides. That's a lot to take in just right there.
Yes,
that's just within those avenues. That's a whole lot, and then we have to think about the importance of maintaining structure the best we can, so that our children can be better people than we were, than we are, right? That's the ultimate goal. And that incorporates its own sets of challenges, because while doing that, we still have to maintain our clarity throughout all of those roles, maintain the clarity while, of course, providing financially, which is, part of the natural role, of course. So when taking on all those sorts of things, we have to think about how our mental health is impacted while taking care of all those roles. And of course, we all know parenting is not easy. And then there's the other dynamic of people who are single parents as well, and who may or may not have the support that they need within the development of their own children, right? So that also opens up the door to the mental health of the child as well. And when we're thinking about the mental health of the child, that coincides with either possibly the lack of mental health, according to the statistics, the lack of mental health that Black fathers have, lack of black mental health treatment that fathers have. So if one person is in need of mental health treatment, that's a significant sign that other people in the household are also in need of that mental health treatment. Because when one person is affected, one or more are also affected, because the dynamic is living within the same home, or maybe even split between homes. So either way, it's a unit. And the mental health treatment is never just for one person.
Right.
When one person can benefit from it in the household, another person can benefit from it, because when we are a unit, we don't suffer alone, whether we see it or not.
Yeah, because I know for me, what motivated me to get into therapy was seeing my daughter go through it.
Yeah, right.
You know, to see her at a young age going in there and telling, like, talking to her therapist and being able to just get there. I sat there and I told myself, if she can do it, why can't I do it?
Right.
You know, and
Right.
and I applaud her for it. I applaud any young person that can know I need to speak to someone.
Right.
I want to kind of go back to the suffering silence, because as you were talking, your brother used the metaphor in our class. And it stands out to me. I always use this comparison when you were talking about, like, just keeping everything in.
Right.
And he used the metaphor of taking out the trash. And when you don't take the trash out and you see it and you just like, I'll take it out another day.
Yeah.
And you just keep on delaying, but you keep piling on. Then eventually when you go to take the garbage out, the bottom explodes.
Right. Right.
And that's what happens with a lot of men. We keep things bottled up and we keep suppressing and pushing down and just not letting our feelings out.
Right.
And then eventually we snap.
Right.
You know, we resort to substance. We resort to drugs. We resort to alcohol. Speak to that as far as the substance, coping through substance, because I know you are, as I said, you're director of specialty substance use.
Yes.
So speak on the usage of drugs and alcohol, and coping through, like, the men coping with that.
Right, sure. Yeah, so with the aspect of substance use and tying that into silence, a lot of times, so since as men we are a little less likely to initially communicate our concerns or the way we feel to whomever is in the area, and we tend to naturally resort to silence, at least in the first stages. And like you mentioned, I'm not ready to talk about that yet, or I need a little bit more time. That certainly works. And I think one of the challenges that comes after that is, when are you going to be ready to talk about that? So when folks are in the stage of not being ready to talk about whatever their challenge is at the moment, that's where the substance use can start to either begin or increase for folks who are already using. So when we think about substance use, we think about a lot of the negative factors that are associated with it, which are, several. And the perspective of a person who is using, whether they're using alcohol or marijuana or whatever their drug of choice is, they're using for a reason. And this is something we just talked about 2 days ago. When folks are using, they're using for a reason. So, of course, that is engaging in an unhealthy behavior, but from the perspective of the person that's using, that may be a behavior that is productive to them in that moment. So, a lot of folks use alcohol as a coping mechanism to forget. Same with marijuana. Same with opioids and opiates. Then you have the stimulant drugs. You have the cocaine. You have the crystal meth. And those things can also keep folks in an elevated state of not thinking about their actual problems. So the catch-22 with that is, a person may not be thinking about their actual problems at that moment when they're using. However, the problems are now becoming compound issues because, I'm not thinking about whatever I'm thinking of at the moment, but I'm also destroying the environment that I'm in, or I'm also showing my children that using substances or whatever a person's drug of choice is might be the way to go to deal with those problems. Of course, we know that's not, but within the realm of addiction, the mental health and the substance use, they tie together and they go hand in hand. So some people will use because of mental health reasons, and then some people have mental health challenges because they use. So they intertwine with one another. And when they do, folks are dually diagnosed, And the presenting problem can always fluctuate depending on what they're going through during that time of their life.
Okay, because I know, and I'm a very transparent person, so I will, I don't mind opening up and letting people know about my past, my transgressions, things I've went through.
Right.
My father is alcoholic, and I mean, it's to a point where, you know, my mother once told him that if you keep this up, you're going to die alone, you know, and he just kept going, you know, he kept going, and it was to the point where I had to separate myself from him, you know, and me doing that was me being like, okay, there's nothing I can do for you. You have to want to get whatever help you need. Yeah. And, you know, he unfortunately is not. So, you know, all I can do for that situation is just, you know, keep him in my prayers and everything. But one thing about like the whole drug use and drinking is it always seems to frustrate me, you know, when I see that, because I'm looking at it as I know that there's trauma, there's certain things that's going on, because I can look at someone and it's okay to have like a drink occasionally, but when it becomes a recurring thing, like you can't function without doing it, I look at that as there's something rooted there that needs to be handled. Speaking, like as you said, we are all speaking about mental health, but mental health became more heightened during the pandemic.
Yes.
Obviously, the loss of jobs, the loss of income. How do you feel like that took a toll on men's mental health? Because as men, we are the providers. Yeah. And if we don't have income, if we don't have a job, how can we then provide for our family, or how can we provide for ourselves? So how did that take a toll on men's mental health from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. So the pandemic took a significant toll on the mental health of a lot of the men and black men that I've seen and that I work with programmatically. In particular, when jobs were shutting down, places were closing, and you know a lot of people didn't have a place to go to for work, and then the pandemic also made it more difficult to seek employment as well, because more places were closed. I've seen a significant decrease in mental health treatment. So individuals who were consistent with their sessions, with their treatment, became less consistent. I've also seen an increase in substance use due to the pandemic, because there was, again, going back to the coping mechanism of you know not having employment and having financial needs for children, ourselves, the families, and so forth. We've seen the substance use increase in several different areas, and a lot of overdoses and some deaths associated with that. But the pandemic really put a hurting on the mental health of men overall, because when men aren't able to work, that kind of goes against the natural inclination to protect and provide, right? And being able to have a steady income, and then losing that income, now there's different sorts of risk. There's a financial risk. There's possible housing loss. Where are we going to go?
Right.
Are we going to be at risk of having to move in with somebody or sleeping on the streets, or whichever the case is? And there's also the social risk too. So going back to the male ego, right? Not having a job due to the pandemic impacts the male ego, which is associated with the bravado that we naturally have, right? So it's kind of like taking the teeth away from a German Shepherd, right? So you know, a German Shepherd doesn't have his teeth. Now a male German Shepherd might feel a little less than, right? Yes. Because that's his primary weapon. That's his primary tool to protect his puppies, right? I like to use a lot of metaphors and stuff like that. But yeah, so the pandemic had really put a dampering on not only the mental health of men, of black men, but the treatment as well. So when folks are going through things, they may be getting to a point where they're less likely to go to treatment because it's gotten too bad. And a lot of times from what my perspective and what I've seen within the people that receive services in the community is when it gets too far, if you miss 1, 2, 3 sessions, it's like, well, I'm too far in the hole. I can't go back now. I've already been gone for a month or a month and a half or whichever it's been. So that the length of time in between sessions and treatment definitely plays a role in whether or not somebody is able to or willing to continue. That gap is a significant factor in the continuation or discontinuation of services.
Now, with the decrease in the treatment, would you say that is because with them losing the jobs that, some jobs they provide health insurance, some, and if they lose their job, they lose their benefits. Right. Would that also be the case when it comes to it?
100%. So the factor of the benefits also holds a significant amount of weight because, again, with the health insurance, we have to think about how many people are on family plans. Mm-hmm. So if I lose my job, then I don't have health insurance, which may be one thing. But if I lose my job and I don't have health insurance and I'm on a family plan, then my 5 kids don't have health insurance, or my wife doesn't have health insurance, or whatever it is. So it goes from a problem to a much more significant problem because you have family members that rely on you for the health insurance, and some people see doctors more than others. Some people have different ailments, some people don't. But that encompasses the risk of several factors, and how someone can try to address those factors once that time comes, the time of unemployment due to the pandemic. In addition, the pandemic, there's another factor with the pandemic being someone losing their job not because of something they did or because of poor performance or because they were showing up late or not showing up at all. Some people lost their jobs out of their control, which is a much more significant blow to take when you've performed well and you've always been consistent, always been on time, always done good work, but you still ended up losing your job. That's another hard pill to swallow. So thinking about how someone can kind of wrap their head around having these major consequences for something they didn't do impacts the overall mental health of not just the person that lost their job, but the family members as well.
And then also within the means of the pandemic, we witnessed the George Floyd murder, which brought a lot of PTSD.
Right.
I've never in my life witnessed a murder on camera like George Floyd.
Right.
We've heard of stories of this. Like they said that his murder was pretty much a public lynching. That brings up the PTSD. Yeah. That brings up for black men seeing that, which then brings up our history with police.
Yep.
We all know police were originally slave catchers. So we have that trauma with our history with police. Yeah. And then we just see that heightened level of paranoia, anger, frustration, all within the midst of being stuck in the house.
Yeah.
As a mental health specialist, if you ever dealt with someone that was going through that, how were you able to help guide them through whatever trouble that they were facing during that time? Because I know me personally, I was speaking to my therapist, and the reason why I appreciate my therapist as much as I do is because she's very open and honest. One of the first things she said when I was expressing my feelings to her about everything that was going on, she was like, I can empathize with you, but I can't relate to what you're going through.
That's it.
But what I can do, let me give you this person's number.
Yep.
Reach out to him. It's a black man. Reach out to him. Because that's someone that you can speak more to about these certain problems that you're going through. Yep. So if you had anyone that during that time, or still, because even though people are saying that we're kind of getting out of the pandemic, we still have, and we will always have, injustice.
For sure.
How do you deal with that when people come to you about that?
Okay, I think as far as the injustice in the pandemic, one of the things that I've done was I've been able to kind of put together a lot of support groups, and it's just isn't even for work. It's just for personal as a person in the community. So I've been able to put together a lot of support groups virtually and even some in person that addressed the intolerance and the systemic racism and walking around with a target on your back, and how those are exacerbated by the pandemic, right? Because as you just mentioned, we are coming out of the pandemic, but the residual effects are still there. Mm-hmm. Some people still hadn't been able to get back to work, and so forth. So being a member of the community, even before I'm a counselor, I think I hold true to that, and I think that's important, because I wouldn't have been a counselor if I wasn't a part of this community. So that kind of comes first. So I think showing a lot of people, especially Black men, that Black men are in need of each other in order to obtain that support.
Iron sharpens iron.
Iron sharpens iron, 100%. And kind of reminding folks that, getting people together in a room and reminding them that they're all here traveling on in the same car, going down the same road at the same time. Of course, that road is going to split into different areas, but still being a Black man in America has its challenges. Some people are still not willing to admit that, and that's okay. That's okay. That's yeah. That just comes, as part of that is the denial piece, but that's for later. And just showing that support and maintaining a frame of, I'm always going to be here for as long as I can. And while I'm here, I'm going to support everyone I can as much as I can. And I think when people know of a consistent and constant person, also such as yourself, people will gravitate more towards you, and that helps with the overall processing of things that are happening in the country. So Black men, being around Black men is one of the most healthy things that we can do for each other. I mean, of course, with regard to being positive about whatever the situation is. And when people understand that, they develop in time, they are able to develop a sense of comfort. So now it's, there's a group of Black men over here. Maybe I should be over here too. Mm-hmm. And that kind of, it's very, very subtle, yet very effective. So I think just us coming together and acknowledging that we're in the same vehicle at the same time brings forth a sense of community intellectually. Now, of course, we all live in different places in the city, but we're still in the same boat intellectually and spiritually, emotionally, because when I go outside, they're going to look at you the way they look at me.
Right.
And vice versa. It doesn't matter if it's Andre or Charles. Mm-hmm. It's still whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
For our final highlight, on June 22nd, 2023, a sculpture was dedicated outside the Central Library to Buffalo-raised poet Lucille Clifton. Clifton was a writer responsible for more than 18 children's books, a dozen poetry books, and, among her many accolades, a National Book Award and an Emmy. Her daughter, Sydney Clifton, and Just Buffalo's artistic director, Barbara Cole, spent some time with Jay Moran reminiscing about the literary giant that was Lucille Clifton.
Well, so much to talk about here. I guess let's just maybe, Barbara, allow you to put Lucille Clifton into perspective for us, being of the Literary Center here in Western New York. Talk about Lucille Clifton, what makes her significant?
Well, Lucille Clifton remains one of the most important writers of the 20th century, period. People all over the world have been inspired by her work and her legacy. So many prominent inaugural poets have cited her as a primary influence. Amanda Gorman and Elizabeth Alexander wrote in The New Yorker that she doesn't think there's an American poet as beloved as Clifton, or one whose influence radiated as widely. And so Lucille Clifton is a beloved writer throughout the world. And we are so proud that Lucille Clifton comes from Buffalo. She was born in Depew, New York, and lived here for 32 years. And we are just absolutely thrilled at Just Buffalo Literary Center to be able to shine a spotlight on Lucille Clifton's life and legacy.
I'll turn it to you, Sydney. When you hear that description of your mother, are you thinking of a literary giant, or are you thinking of Mom?
All of the above,
Yeah.
actually, because we recognize her contributions, and the poems that she wrote so reflected her life that it was not a leap. It is all of those things. She was all those things to us and continues to be.
What was she like as a mom?
Non-traditional, I would say,
Okay.
in that although there were 6 of us, my parents had 6 children in 7 years, so there was a lot of energy in the house. Mom was very much sort of focused on who are these people, rather than these are my children. Now, don't get me wrong; she was very protective of her kids, but she also recognized each of our individual gifts. And I think that although we all shared the mothering, we had individual relationships with her where we had different conversations and different focuses, and she really was able to make us each feel like we were all each her favorite in different ways. She never said that, by the way,
Right.
but I really felt that as a mother, she modeled for us being authentically who you are, asking a lot of questions, and following whatever your individual bliss was. And it didn't have to be each other's. We never felt like there was pressure to do a thing or this thing or that thing, or be ambitious in the way that she was, or not ambitious in other ways. So I think that as a mom, that for me certainly was the best mothering.
How about the realization that, I guess, when it happened and how it felt, when you realized how big a deal your mom was?
It's so funny. I used to go to readings with her at times, and my sisters have done the same thing. And when you see the audiences and when you see people responding to her in the way that it's like, Mom must be something. I mean, okay. And I have to say, there were times where I was equally very proud and intimidated by it. Because as a child, you're a little self-absorbed, and you think like, does this mean that this fame, this reputation, this work is taking her away from us? And I think each of us sort of struggled with that, or at least asked ourselves the question for a while. But once we saw that this was just another manifestation of when you are walking in that bliss, all of you, bring all of you to the table, and it doesn't diminish any other piece of you. Once we felt comfortable with that, once we saw it, it sort of relaxed. But I was proud of the lady. I remain proud of her.
I can appreciate that. I'm proud that she's from Buffalo. That's the way we are here in Western New York. I had an old colleague who used to say, if you had a layover in the Buffalo airport, we called you a native from Buffalo. But that's another story. Back to maybe you can give us some insight then. Here is a woman, Lucille Clifton, 14 collections of poetry books, 18 children's books. What did you see in terms of her work ethic? Obviously, with 6 kids in a short period of time, that on its own is its own full-time job. In terms of work ethic and inspiration, what can you give us about that?
In terms of work ethic, I can comment on that in retrospect, but as we were growing up, it just looked like Mom was at the table writing. Okay. That's what she did. That's what she did, rather, and that's who she was. We also recognize that you don't bother her while she's doing that, but honestly, we didn't know any different. This is just Mom and her writing. We thought everybody's mother wrote, actually. we thought, when does your mom do her work? Where does she like to set up? Because Mom wrote at the dining room table primarily, and so that was just what we knew. Honestly, in terms of inspiration, I think Mom found inspiration everywhere. She certainly found it in her children with her children's books, but I think that we also recognized that for her, the poetry was her resolving some things. And my mom was very intuitive, very curious, very intelligent, very creative, very empathetic. So she also always had curiosity about people and places and things and historical figures and such, and I wonder what that person's life was like. I wonder what that felt like for them. And was able to then sort of poem it, as she would say, as she would describe it. She would just poem that out. I think she also recognized that a lot of things were very cathartic for her in certain times when there were aspects of her life that she was sort of pushing away. Her being a poet allowed her to resolve, ask the questions, get some closure, give herself some grace often on events of her life and people she loved and mistakes she thought she made, etc. So I think the inspiration was, this helps me, and if it helps me, it could provide a light for someone else. Because she always recognized that surely she's not the only one who has experienced something like this. And that was a kind of service, I think, that her life and her work really, I don't even know if she knew until later in her life how deeply healing her work was for so many people.
Barbara, you're a poet yourself. The life of a poet is obviously not one that gets laid out in any kind of a specific structure, but maybe you give us an idea of what it must have taken to get to the level of notoriety that Lucille Clifton had. Can you give us an idea how that would be? Because as Sydney was talking, I might write some things out to be cathartic and try to work through, the problems of the day, the issues of the day, but nobody's going to read my stuff. A lot of people have read Lucille Clifton's. What about that trajectory? How does that evolve?
Well, that's a great question, Jay, and I think you're right that there are so many people who are writing at home, but maybe don't have the courage to share it. And what's extraordinary, I think, about Lucille Clifton's life, she started writing poems, we know, at the age of 10. That's the earliest poems that we have of hers. But really, her career was launched when her friend here in Buffalo, Ishmael Reed, who is another incredibly important 20th century writer, Ishmael Reed encouraged her to send her poems to Langston Hughes, who was editing the groundbreaking anthology Poetry of the Negro, and Langston Hughes recognized in Lucille Clifton, who was an unknown writer at the time, he recognized just how extraordinary her work was. And to read Clifton's work now, it is still groundbreaking, but to imagine how groundbreaking her voice and her style and the humor and so many of the aspects of it that Sydney just mentioned, with addressing, she's pulling in African history with contemporary events and her own personal life in almost a confessional mode. There's humor and there's joy. There's also grief and loss. She just was all-encompassing. And I think to have a career like Lucille Clifton's would be the dream for most writers. But I hope that it's a source of inspiration, the courage that she had and the courage of her convictions, to never shy away from dark truths or complicated topics. She just brought her courage to the page every day.
We're talking about Lucille Clifton today on Buffalo What's Next. As a matter of fact, we don't necessarily just have to talk about her. We can hear from Lucille Clifton. As a matter of fact, we have her reciting one of her poems right here.
And this universal poem is called Homage to My Hips. These hips are big hips. They need space to move around in. They don't fit into little petty places. These hips are free hips. They don't like to be held back. These hips have never been enslaved. They go where they want to go. They do what they want to do. These hips are mighty hips. These hips are magic hips. I have known them to put a spell on a man and to spin him like a top.
Well, Sydney Clifton, there's Mom taking us in a lot of directions in a short period of time.
Exactly.
What do you? And I could see you were mouthing a couple of the lines, as a matter of fact. So you're familiar with it. Well, what about that particular work and maybe other works like that? What do we know about? What does that say about Lucille Clifton?
That she was audacious and and funny, and this poem was sort of the antidote to women being taught that their curvy bodies were not acceptable and not okay, particularly Black women. So that for me was this was like an anthem that we truly, truly loved, and that also the fact that she was able to provide that for people. She's like, I think many women, I can't say all women, but many women struggle with a lot of sort of body issues and self-love and concern and insecurity about, am I attractive, am I this, am I that, that sort of thing. And this was part of her way of declaring her independence from that negativity. And I just love hearing that every time.
Sydney was born here in Buffalo, but moved away not too long after her with her large family and moved to Maryland. So this is your first time back in Buffalo.
This is my first time back in 50 years. And
how does it feel?
Surreal. Very surreal. We're going to be doing a Places That the Cliftons Lived tour probably sometime tomorrow. But there are things I still recognize. I have sort of flashes of visual memory, and even sort of these are the kind of trees I grew up with. This is the landscape. This is how this sort of smelled. So there's something about it that's like deeply resonant, and I probably won't process it for another couple days, probably.
What about the Buffalo connection in Lucille's work? And Barbara, you could probably speak to this as well. What about that? We talk about her moving away, going to Maryland. That's where her career blossomed. But what about the Buffalo connection? Is it seen in her work?
Buffalo is woven throughout her work. There's numerous poems about growing up on Purdy Street. You mentioned her books of poems and her many children's books, but she also wrote a memoir edited by Nobel Prize winner Toni Morrison. Wow. And her memoir very much tells the story of her own life woven together with the lives of her father and some of her ancestors. And Buffalo is just so clearly such an important foundational grounding throughout so much of her work. And that's part of the reason why we felt it was so important for Buffalo to really recognize Clifton is one of the great writers who has walked these streets and called these neighborhoods home. She is a daughter of the East Side who went on to such greatness, and what an inspiring story for all Western New Yorkers.
We thank you for joining us. This has been Buffalo What's Next Producers Picks. We also would like to thank all our guests this week: Judson Price, Andre Stokes Jr., Barbara Cole, and Sydney Clifton. As a reminder, Buffalo What's Next airs on WBFO every weekday, 10 to 11, and re-airs each weeknight at 9. Each episode is also available wherever you get your podcasts, the Amplify BTPM app, and also on demand at WBFO.org. I'm producer Lorenzo Rodriguez. Thank you very much for listening.